Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to take you on a journey through the walls of one of South Africa's most notorious and historically significant prisons, Pollsmoor Prison. Located in Cape Town, this high-security facility is more than just a correctional institution. It is a place deeply intertwined with South Africa's history, particularly its struggle for justice, human rights, and the fight against apartheid. Pollsmoor Prison stands as a stark reminder of both the failures and challenges within the country's criminal justice system. While its primary function has always been to house the most dangerous criminals in the nation, it has also been home to political prisoners, individuals who were not behind bars for crimes of violence or theft, but rather for their beliefs and resistance against oppression. This prison is not just a place of confinement. It is an institution that has witnessed immense suffering, resilience, and transformation over the years. It is a place where history and justice intersect, where lives have been broken, and where stories of endurance and struggle continue to emerge. But why is Pollsmoor Prison so infamous? What makes it different from other prisons in South Africa and around the world? The answer lies not just in the crimes of those who are held within its walls, but in the conditions they endure, the history that haunts it, and the impact it has had on South African society. From its earliest days, Pollsmoor was designed to be one of the country's most secure prisons, intended to house individuals who pose the greatest threats to society. However, over time, it became more than just a facility for criminals. It became a tool of political oppression, a breeding ground for gangs, and a symbol of the deep divisions that existed in South Africa's past. To truly understand the significance of Pollsmoor, we must examine not only its history, but also the lives of those who have passed through its gates. Some entered as dangerous criminals, others as political prisoners fighting for justice, and many as young individuals who were swept up in a system that often fails to rehabilitate. Each of these stories contributes to the larger narrative of Pollsmoor, a place that represents both punishment and perseverance. As we explore the various aspects of this infamous institution, we must ask ourselves, what does a prison like Pollsmoor say about the society that built it? What lessons can be learned from its history? And most importantly, how can we ensure that institutions meant for justice do not become centers of oppression? Pollsmoor Prison is not just a name. It is a legacy, a warning, and a lesson in resilience. Pollsmoor Prison is located in the picturesque city of Cape Town, South Africa. Despite its surroundings, which include some of the most breathtaking landscapes in the country, Pollsmoor stands in stark contrast to the beauty beyond its walls. It is a place synonymous with confinement, suffering, and a long history of crime and punishment. Situated in the suburb of Tokai, just a short distance from the bustling heart of Cape Town, this prison has earned a reputation as one of the toughest and most overcrowded correctional facilities in the nation. The prison was originally constructed during the 1960s to replace the older and smaller Roland Street Jail, which was no longer able to meet the demands of a growing prison population. The government needed a larger, more secure facility to house some of the country's most dangerous criminals. As a result, Pollsmoor was designed as a high-security institution, meant to isolate individuals who posed significant threats to society. From its inception, the prison was built with strict security measures in mind. It consists of multiple sections, each designated for different types of prisoners. These include maximum security wings for violent offenders, medium security areas, and sections for juveniles and awaiting trial detainees. However, despite its original structure and purpose, the prison has struggled with severe overcrowding, which has only worsened the conditions inside. While Pollsmoor was primarily intended to house criminals, its role changed significantly during the apartheid era. It became a key facility for the imprisonment of political activists who opposed the South African government's policies of racial segregation and discrimination. Many anti-apartheid leaders were transferred to Pollsmoor after serving time elsewhere, often facing even harsher conditions than before. The facility became a symbol of the government's determination to suppress opposition, using imprisonment as a means of silencing voices that demanded justice and equality. The choice of location for Pollsmoor was strategic. Cape Town, being one of South Africa's major cities, required a high-security prison that could hold some of the region's most notorious offenders. Additionally, the area surrounding the prison provided a level of natural isolation, making escape attempts extremely difficult. Over time, however, the city's expansion brought more residential areas and commercial developments closer to the prison, further highlighting the stark contrast between life inside and outside its walls. Pollsmoor's establishment marked a turning point in South Africa's prison system. While it was built with the intention of maintaining strict control over its inmates, its history has proven that no amount of walls or bars can suppress the spirit of those who fight for justice. Its location and construction reflect the challenges South Africa has faced in balancing security, human rights, and the need for prison reform. Understanding the establishment of Pollsmoor Prison is crucial in recognizing how institutions of confinement can shape the course of history. It was never just a place to hold criminals. It became a symbol of oppression, resilience, and, in some ways, transformation. Pollsmoor Prison is not just another correctional facility. It is one of South Africa's most notorious and feared institutions. Over the decades, it has built a reputation for being one of the toughest, most overcrowded, and most violent prisons in the country. The name Pollsmoor alone is enough to instill fear and anxiety, not only among inmates, but also among those familiar with its brutal conditions. The prison is infamous for several reasons, including its extreme levels of gang violence, overcrowding, harsh treatment of inmates, and the dangerous criminals it houses. The conditions within its walls have been described as some of the worst in the world, drawing concern from human rights organizations and former prisoners who have spoken out about their experiences. One of the biggest contributors to Pollsmoor's fearsome reputation is its overcrowding crisis. Designed to hold around 3,900 inmates, the prison often houses more than double that number, creating an environment of chaos, suffering, and desperation. The lack of space means that prisoners are forced to sleep on the floor in filthy, overcrowded cells, sometimes with 40 to 50 men crammed into a room meant for only a fraction of that number. This extreme congestion leads to violence, disease, and psychological torment. Adding to its notoriety is the presence of powerful prison gangs. Pollsmoor is home to some of the most feared gangs in South Africa, including the 20 SIXS, 27s, and 28s, infamous prison gangs that operate under strict codes of violence and hierarchy. These gangs control many aspects of prison life, from food distribution to drug trafficking, and even the fate of new inmates. Young prisoners are often recruited or forced into these gangs, leading to a cycle of violence that extends beyond the prison walls into South African society at large. Reports of extreme brutality and abuse within Pollsmoor further cement its grim reputation. Inmates often suffer from physical and sexual violence, with little intervention from the authorities. Corruption among prison guards has also been reported, with some officers allegedly cooperating with gang leaders to maintain control over the prison population. The combination of corrupt officials, dangerous criminals, and a failing system has made Pollsmoor one of the deadliest prisons in the country. The prison's poor sanitation and lack of medical care have also been a major concern. Diseases such as tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS spread rapidly due to overcrowding and unsanitary conditions. Inmates have little access to proper health care, and many suffer from malnutrition and other illnesses that go untreated. The psychological toll of these conditions is severe, leading to increased aggression, hopelessness, and mental health crises among prisoners. Despite numerous reports and calls for reform, the harsh conditions of Pollsmoor persist, making it a symbol of South Africa's struggling prison system. Its reputation as a place of suffering and violence continues to grow, serving as a warning of what happens when justice systems fail to prioritize rehabilitation over punishment. The reality of life inside Pollsmoor is not just a story of crime and confinement. It is a reflection of deeper issues within society, from poverty and inequality to the failures of law enforcement and governance. Pollsmoor Prison is not just known for housing dangerous criminals. It also holds a significant place in history for detaining political prisoners, particularly during the apartheid era in South Africa. While its high-security walls were meant to keep violent offenders away from society, they also served as a tool of oppression against those who dared to challenge the unjust system of racial segregation. During apartheid, the South African government used imprisonment as one of its most powerful weapons against activists and freedom fighters. Anyone who opposed the government's policies, spoke out against racial discrimination, or played a role in the struggle for equality was at risk of being arrested and detained. Many of these individuals were charged under vague and unjust laws, accused of conspiracy, inciting resistance, or simply being associated with anti-apartheid movements. Pollsmoor became one of the main prisons where these political prisoners were sent. Unlike common criminals, these men and women were not behind bars because they had stolen, murdered, or committed acts of violence. They were imprisoned for their ideas, their beliefs, and their refusal to accept oppression. The government saw them as threats, not because they were dangerous individuals, but because they were powerful voices for change. Life for political prisoners at Pollsmoor was extremely harsh. The prison authorities did not treat them with any special consideration. In fact, in many cases, they were subjected to even harsher conditions than regular inmates. They were often kept in solitary confinement for extended periods, isolated from other prisoners to break their spirit and prevent them from spreading their message. Interrogation, psychological torment, and physical abuse were common tactics used by the authorities to weaken these activists. Many political prisoners were denied proper legal representation, and their trials, if they even had one, were often unfair. The conditions inside Pollsmoor were already brutal for ordinary prisoners, but for those who had been arrested for political reasons, the mistreatment was even worse. Despite the suffering, many of these prisoners refused to be broken. They continued their activism behind bars, organizing discussions, educating fellow inmates, and maintaining their commitment to the struggle for freedom. Their resilience in the face of extreme hardship became an inspiration to others, both inside and outside the prison. Even within the confines of Pollsmoor, they remained symbols of resistance against oppression. The imprisonment of political figures at Pollsmoor was not just about keeping them locked away. It was a strategy to silence their voices and weaken the movements they led. However, rather than achieving its goal, the government's use of Pollsmoor as a political prison only highlighted the cruelty of apartheid to the world. The international community began paying more attention, and human rights organizations raised concerns about the treatment of detainees. As the anti-apartheid movement gained strength, the presence of political prisoners at Pollsmoor became a global issue. Their continued detention became a symbol of South Africa's brutal policies, fueling even more resistance both inside and outside the country. The very individuals the government sought to silence became even more powerful, proving that ideas and principles cannot be imprisoned. Pollsmoor Prison is one of South Africa's most secure and heavily guarded correctional facilities. Built to house some of the country's most dangerous criminals, the prison operates under strict security measures designed to prevent escapes, riots, and violent incidents among inmates. However, despite these efforts, the prison's high population and internal gang dynamics often challenge its security structure. Pollsmoor is classified as a maximum security prison, meaning it holds individuals convicted of serious crimes, including murder, armed robbery, organized crime, and violent offenses. The facility is divided into different sections based on the security risk of inmates, their criminal history, and their status in the prison system. The maximum security section is the most tightly controlled area of Pollsmoor, reserved for the most violent and high-risk criminals. Prisoners here are often individuals serving long sentences, or those considered a serious threat to public safety. This section has heavily reinforced cells, strict surveillance, and limited inmate movement. Prisoners are kept under close watch, and their access to other areas of the prison is highly restricted. The medium security section houses inmates convicted of less violent crimes, or those serving shorter sentences. While security remains strict, prisoners here have slightly more freedom of movement and access to prison programs, such as vocational training and rehabilitation efforts. However, due to overcrowding, many prisoners who should be in lower security facilities are often placed in medium security cells, increasing the risk of violence and internal conflicts. There is also a juvenile section within Pollsmoor, meant for young offenders. These inmates are often individuals who have been arrested for petty crimes or gang-related activities. Unfortunately, Due to the influence of hardened criminals and prison gangs, many of these young prisoners become more deeply involved in criminal networks rather than being rehabilitated. The lack of proper rehabilitation programs and educational opportunities has made this section of Pollsmoor a breeding ground for future criminal activity. One of the most heavily guarded areas is the awaiting trial section, where prisoners who have not yet been convicted are held while awaiting court proceedings. Due to South Africa's slow judicial process and high crime rate, this section is often overcrowded, leading to major security concerns. Many prisoners spend months or even years in this section without being convicted, creating frustration and tensions that frequently result in violent outbreaks. Despite the strict security measures, Pollsmoor has struggled with maintaining control over the prison population. The rise of prison gangs, including the 20 SIXS, 27s, and 28s, has made internal security extremely difficult. These gangs operate under their own set of rules, often exerting more power over inmates than the prison authorities themselves. They control smuggling operations, initiate violent attacks, and recruit new members from among the most vulnerable prisoners. Prison guards at Pollsmoor face constant challenges in enforcing order. Corruption among staff is a serious issue, with some guards being bribed to smuggle contraband such as drugs, weapons, and mobile phones into the prison. This corruption weakens security measures, allowing gang leaders to continue their criminal activities even while behind bars. The prison also employs various surveillance technologies, including security cameras, guard towers, and reinforced gates to prevent escapes. However, despite these precautions, escape attempts have been made in the past, some of which have been successful. These incidents highlight the difficulties of maintaining order in an overcrowded and highly volatile environment. Pollsmoor's security structure reflects the broader challenges of South Africa's prison system, balancing the need for strict control with the goal of rehabilitation. While the prison was designed to contain the most dangerous criminals, its internal struggles with overcrowding, gang violence, and corruption often undermine the very security it aims to enforce. Pollsmoor Prison is notorious not only for its high security status, but also for the inhumane and degrading living conditions that inmates endure daily. Over the years, reports from human rights organizations, former inmates, and prison officials have painted a disturbing picture of life behind its walls. The combination of extreme overcrowding, poor hygiene, violence, and lack of basic medical care makes Pollsmoor one of the toughest prisons in South Africa. One of the most pressing issues is overcrowding. Originally designed to house around 3,900 inmates, Pollsmoor often holds more than double that number. Cells meant for a handful of prisoners are packed with dozens, leaving barely any space to move. Inmates are forced to sleep on the cold concrete floor, often without mattresses or blankets. Some are crammed so tightly into cells that they must take turns lying down. The lack of space leads to extreme discomfort, restlessness, and frequent outbursts of violence. The sanitation conditions inside Pollsmoor are equally appalling. Toilets are often broken or insufficient for the number of prisoners in a cell, leading to unhygienic conditions where inmates are forced to relieve themselves in buckets. The stench of human waste lingers in the air, contributing to the spread of diseases. Clean drinking water is scarce, and access to showers is limited. Many inmates go days or even weeks without being able to properly wash themselves, leading to severe skin infections and other hygiene-related illnesses. Violence is a constant reality inside the prison. Due to overcrowding, inmates are frequently housed alongside some of the most dangerous criminals in South Africa. With limited supervision from guards, fights break out daily, often resulting in serious injuries or even death. Gang-related violence is particularly rampant, as prison gangs control much of the prison's internal operations. New inmates are often targeted for initiation rituals, extortion, or physical abuse. Those who refuse to submit to gang dominance live in constant fear of being attacked. Sexual violence is another grim reality of life at Pollsmoor. Reports have detailed instances of inmates being assaulted by fellow prisoners, with little to no intervention from authorities. The lack of proper surveillance and the sheer number of prisoners make it difficult to control these crimes. Many victims are too afraid to speak out, knowing that retaliation from gangs or other inmates is inevitable. The lack of medical care further worsens the situation. Diseases such as tuberculosis, HIV, AIDS, and other infections spread rapidly due to overcrowding and unsanitary conditions. Many inmates suffer from malnutrition, as food supplies are often inadequate or of extremely poor quality. Meals are basic, often consisting of watery porridge or bread, lacking the necessary nutrients for basic health. Inmates who fall sick rarely receive timely medical attention, as the prison's healthcare facilities are overwhelmed and understaffed. Those with chronic illnesses or injuries are often left untreated, leading to further complications and even deaths. Beyond the physical hardships, the psychological impact of life in Pollsmoor is severe. The stress of surviving in such a hostile environment leads to high levels of anxiety, depression, and aggression among inmates. Many prisoners develop severe mental health issues due to isolation, constant fear of violence, and the harsh treatment they receive. Suicide attempts are not uncommon, as some inmates see no escape from the brutal conditions they face daily. While there have been efforts to improve the situation, the sheer number of prisoners and lack of resources make meaningful change difficult. Reports from human rights organizations have called for urgent prison reforms, yet conditions remain dire. Pollsmoor continues to be a place where survival is a daily struggle and where the idea of rehabilitation is overshadowed by the harsh reality of its living conditions. Pollsmoor Prison is one of South Africa's most overcrowded correctional facilities, a crisis that has persisted for decades. Built to house approximately 3,900 inmates, the prison often accommodates more than double that number, creating conditions that are not only inhumane but also dangerous for both prisoners and staff. This extreme overcrowding is one of the primary factors behind the prison's reputation for violence, disease, and the failure of rehabilitation efforts. One of the most immediate consequences of overcrowding is the lack of personal space. Cells that were originally designed to hold a handful of inmates are now packed with dozens. In many cases, as many as 40 to 50 men are crammed into a single cell meant for only 10 or 15. There are not enough beds, so most prisoners are forced to sleep on the floor, using makeshift bedding or nothing at all. The lack of ventilation and the body heat from so many people packed into a small space create unbearable conditions, especially in the summer months when temperatures inside the cells soar. Overcrowding also leads to a severe shortage of basic necessities. There are not enough toilets, showers, or sinks to accommodate the prison population, leading to unsanitary conditions. Inmates often have to share one toilet with dozens of others, and with plumbing frequently breaking down, many are forced to relieve themselves in buckets or makeshift containers. This lack of hygiene contributes to the rapid spread of diseases such as tuberculosis, hepatitis, and skin infections. With limited access to clean water, inmates struggle to maintain even the most basic hygiene, further worsening health conditions. Food shortages are another serious issue. The prison's kitchen was never designed to feed such a large number of people, and as a result, meals are often insufficient and nutritionally poor. Inmates receive small portions of watery porridge, bread, or rice, with little to no protein or vegetables. Malnutrition is common, leaving many prisoners weak and vulnerable to illness. The lack of proper nutrition also contributes to increased aggression and tension among inmates, as hunger fuels frustration and violence. The strain on medical facilities is another dire consequence of overcrowding. Pollsmoor's healthcare system is overwhelmed, with too few doctors and nurses to attend to the ever-growing number of prisoners in need of treatment. Sick inmates often have to wait days or even weeks for medical attention, and those with chronic conditions such as diabetes, tuberculosis, or HIV/AIDS rarely receive the consistent care they need. The combination of poor nutrition, unsanitary conditions, and inadequate health care creates a humanitarian crisis within the prison, where preventable illnesses often lead to death. Beyond physical suffering, overcrowding also has a devastating psychological impact on inmates. Being confined in such a stressful, violent, and oppressive environment leads to extreme mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, and suicidal tendencies. Many inmates experience severe emotional breakdowns due to the constant fear of violence, lack of privacy, and the harsh conditions they are forced to endure. Those who enter the prison with minor offenses or first-time convictions often leave with deep psychological scars, making reintegration into society even more difficult. One of the most dangerous effects of overcrowding is the increase in violence and gang activity. With too many prisoners and too few guards, maintaining order becomes nearly impossible. Gangs thrive in this environment, recruiting new members from among the most vulnerable prisoners. New arrivals are often given an ultimatum: join a gang for protection or become easy targets for violence, extortion, and abuse. The lack of proper security measures means that fights, stabbings, and even murders occur frequently, with prison staff unable to intervene effectively. Overcrowding also undermines any chance of rehabilitation. With so many inmates and so few resources, educational programs, vocational training, and counseling services are extremely limited. Instead of focusing on reforming inmates and preparing them for life after prison, the system simply holds them in a cycle of violence and survival. Many prisoners leave Pollsmoor more hardened and dangerous than when they entered, contributing to South Africa's high rates of repeat offenses. Despite ongoing calls for reform, the issue of overcrowding remains one of Pollsmoor's greatest challenges. The lack of alternative sentencing options, slow judicial processes, and high crime rates continue to flood the prison with more inmates than it can handle. Until significant changes are made in the criminal justice system, Pollsmoor will remain a symbol of the failures of South Africa's prison system, an overcrowded, violent, and inhumane institution where survival takes precedence over justice or rehabilitation. Pollsmoor Prison is infamous not just for its harsh conditions and overcrowding but also for the terrifying grip that gangs have over its inmates. The prison is home to some of the most feared and well-organized prison gangs in South Africa, including the numbers gangs, the 20SAXS, 27s, and 28s. These gangs operate under their own strict codes and hierarchies, controlling nearly every aspect of prison life, from food distribution to drug trafficking, from protection rackets to violent punishments. For many inmates, these gangs are a source of both survival and suffering, as refusing to join can mean becoming an easy target for violence. One of the main reasons gangs thrive in Pollsmoor is the lack of effective law enforcement and control within the prison walls. Due to extreme overcrowding and a shortage of guards, the authorities often struggle to maintain order. Many guards fear for their own safety and turn a blind eye to gang activities, while others are actively involved in corrupt dealings, smuggling contraband in exchange for money or protection. This has allowed the gangs to establish a parallel power structure inside the prison, one that often holds more influence over inmates than the actual prison administration. Each of the major gangs within Pollsmoor has its own role and function. The 20SXS primarily focus on smuggling and financial crimes, controlling the flow of money, drugs, and other contraband within the prison. The 27s act as enforcers, dealing with punishments, violence, and revenge killings. The 28s are known for their brutal discipline, enforcing strict loyalty among members and controlling the prison's sex trade. These gangs operate under a complex system of initiation, rank, and rules, and once a prisoner is recruited, leaving the gang is nearly impossible. For many inmates, joining a gang is not a choice, it is a matter of survival. New arrivals, especially young and first-time offenders, are often faced with a brutal reality. They must either align themselves with a gang for protection or risk being assaulted, robbed, or even killed. Initiation rituals can be violent and humiliating, involving acts of aggression against rival gangs or even fellow inmates. Those who refuse to join a gang often live in constant fear, knowing that they are seen as easy prey in an environment where strength and numbers dictate survival. The level of violence within Pollsmoor is largely fueled by gang rivalries. Stabbings, beatings, and even murders are common occurrences, with disputes over power, territory, and resources leading to deadly confrontations. Many of these acts of violence are carried out as part of gang discipline, ensuring that members remain loyal and obedient. Punishments for betrayal or disobedience can be severe, ranging from brutal beatings to forced isolation and even execution-style killings. The presence of weapons, often homemade knives and sharpened objects, adds to the constant threat of bloodshed. Gangs also control the trade of contraband, including drugs, cigarettes, cell phones, and even food. With prison rations often being inadequate, inmates rely on these underground markets to survive. The most common drug circulating within Pollsmoor is crystal meth, which is smuggled in through corrupt officials or hidden inside visitors' belongings. Addiction is rampant, and many inmates end up in debt to the gangs, further deepening their control over the prison population. Those who cannot repay their debts often face brutal consequences, including violent beatings or forced labor for the gang. Despite efforts by prison authorities to curb gang violence, their strategies have largely been ineffective. Isolation tactics, transferring gang leaders to other prisons, and crackdowns on contraband have done little to break the cycle. In some cases, moving gang members to other prisons only spreads their influence further. The deeply ingrained gang culture within Pollsmoor has made it nearly impossible to eradicate their control, as new recruits continue to join their ranks every day. The dominance of gangs within Pollsmoor is a reflection of a larger issue within South Africa's criminal justice system. Many of these gangs originate in the country's poorest communities, where crime and gang life are often seen as the only means of survival. Young offenders who enter Pollsmoor for minor crimes often leave as hardened criminals, recruited into a life of violence that extends far beyond the prison walls. Instead of being rehabilitated, they become even more entrenched in gang culture, perpetuating the cycle of crime in society. The power of gangs within Pollsmoor Prison highlights the failure of the prison system to provide security, rehabilitation, and justice. Without significant reforms, including better inmate management, stronger security measures, and more effective rehabilitation programs, Pollsmoor will continue to be ruled by gang violence, where survival depends not on rehabilitation but on allegiance to the numbers gangs. Corruption is one of the biggest challenges facing Pollsmoor Prison, making an already dangerous environment even more unstable. While the facility is meant to enforce law and order, many of the very individuals responsible for maintaining discipline, prison guards, wardens, and administrators, are involved in corrupt practices. The combination of low wages, overcrowding, understaffing, and the overwhelming power of prison gangs has created a system where bribery, smuggling, and abuse of power are rampant. One of the most common forms of corruption at Pollsmoor is the smuggling of contraband. Due to the strict security measures at the prison's entrance, it is difficult for inmates' families to bring in prohibited items like drugs, weapons, and mobile phones. However, corrupt prison staff members have become a primary channel for smuggling these items into the prison. For the right price, some wardens are willing to bypass security checks, allowing gang leaders and influential inmates to gain access to phones, cigarettes, narcotics, and even weapons. These items not only fuel violence, but also strengthen the control of powerful prison gangs, allowing them to continue their criminal activities from behind bars. Drugs are a particularly severe issue. The most commonly smuggled drug inside Pollsmoor is crystal meth, which has a devastating impact on inmates. Drug use leads to increased aggression, paranoia, and violent outbreaks, making the prison even more dangerous. Once addicted, inmates become further entangled in the gang system, as these organizations control the flow of drugs and dictate who can buy or use them. Corrupt guards who facilitate this trade do so at the cost of prisoners' well-being, as addiction spreads like wildfire within the overcrowded cells. Another widespread issue is the abuse of power by prison staff. Some guards use their authority to exploit prisoners, demanding bribes in exchange for small privileges such as better food, access to medical care, or even protection from violence. Inmates who refuse to cooperate or cannot afford to pay are often subjected to harsher treatment, including physical abuse, solitary confinement, or being deliberately placed in cells with violent offenders as punishment. In some cases, corrupt guards even collaborate directly with prison gangs, offering them protection or inside information in exchange for money. These alliances make it nearly impossible to break the cycle of gang dominance within Pollsmoor. When prison officials turn a blind eye or actively participate in illegal activities, gang leaders gain even more power, making it harder for authorities to restore order. Inmates who attempt to expose corruption often face severe retaliation, either from the gangs themselves or from prison staff who do not want their illicit activities uncovered. The judicial and disciplinary systems within Pollsmoor are also heavily influenced by corruption. Prisoners with financial resources or gang connections can often bribe their way into receiving preferential treatment, such as being transferred to less crowded cells, getting access to better food, or avoiding harsh disciplinary actions. Meanwhile, poorer inmates and those without gang protection are left to suffer under the harshest conditions. This creates a deeply unfair and dangerous environment where survival is often dictated not by behavior or reform efforts, but by money and influence. Corruption also affects rehabilitation and parole opportunities. Ideally, prisons should provide inmates with a chance to reintegrate into society through educational programs, vocational training, and parole hearings. However, at Pollsmoor, many of these opportunities are either mismanaged or manipulated by corrupt officials. Some inmates are able to secure early release through bribery, while others who meet the legal criteria for parole are denied simply because they lack the financial means to buy their way out. This undermines any attempts at genuine rehabilitation and further erodes trust in the criminal justice system. Beyond the prison walls, corruption within Pollsmoor also damages public confidence in the South African prison system. When reports surface about guards smuggling drugs, abusing prisoners, or working with gangs, it raises serious concerns about whether the prison is serving its intended purpose. Instead of being a place for reform and justice, Pollsmoor has become a breeding ground for further criminal activity, with corrupt officials playing a key role in perpetuating the problem. Despite efforts by the South African Department of Correctional Services to curb corruption, the issue remains deeply entrenched. Occasional crackdowns and investigations have led to the dismissal or arrest of some corrupt officials, but the root causes, low pay, overcrowding, and the overwhelming influence of gangs, continue to fuel the problem. Without major reforms, corruption at Pollsmoor will remain a fundamental barrier to restoring law, order, and justice within its walls. Pollsmoor Prison is not just known for its harsh conditions and gang violence. It is also a place where disease spreads rapidly due to overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate medical care. The prison has been repeatedly criticized by human rights organizations for failing to meet even the most basic healthcare standards, leaving inmates vulnerable to life-threatening illnesses. With thousands of prisoners crammed into tight, unsanitary spaces, the facility has become a breeding ground for infectious diseases such as tuberculosis, TB, HIV, AIDS, and hepatitis. The lack of access to proper medical treatment only makes the situation worse, creating a crisis where inmates suffer in silence, often with fatal consequences. One of the most serious health threats inside Pollsmoor is tuberculosis, TB, which spreads rapidly due to overcrowding and poor ventilation. The prison cells are designed to hold far fewer inmates than they currently do, forcing prisoners to sleep in close quarters with little fresh air. In such conditions, airborne diseases like TB thrive, with infected individuals easily passing the illness to others through coughing or sneezing. Many inmates enter the prison already suffering from undiagnosed TB, and without proper medical screenings, the disease goes unnoticed until it reaches advanced stages. The lack of timely diagnosis and treatment means that infected inmates continue to spread the disease, creating an uncontainable health crisis within the facility. Another major concern is HIV/AIDS, which is prevalent among South Africa's prison population. The disease spreads through various means, including unprotected sexual activity, shared needles among drug users, and blood contact during violent altercations. Many inmates arrive at Pollsmoor with pre-existing HIV infections, but once inside, their health deteriorates rapidly due to malnutrition, untreated illnesses, and a lack of access to antiretroviral therapy, ART. The prison's medical facilities are overwhelmed, making it difficult for infected inmates to receive the consistent care needed to manage the disease. Additionally, the stigma surrounding HIV/AIDS prevents many inmates from seeking help, leaving them to suffer in silence as their condition worsens. Hepatitis and other infectious diseases also pose a serious risk to inmates. The unsanitary conditions in which prisoners live, limited access to clean water, shared toilet facilities, and inadequate hygiene contribute to the rapid spread of infections. Hepatitis, which is transmitted through contaminated food, water, or bodily fluids, is especially dangerous in a setting where healthcare is scarce. Many inmates with hepatitis go untreated, leading to liver failure and other serious complications. Skin infections, lice infestations, and scabies are also widespread, as prisoners are unable to maintain proper hygiene due to limited access to soap, clean clothes, and showers. The lack of medical care and trained healthcare professionals further exacerbates the crisis. Pollsmoor's medical facilities are understaffed and ill-equipped to handle the sheer number of sick inmates. Prison doctors and nurses are overwhelmed, forced to choose which patients receive treatment while others are left to suffer. In many cases, inmates have to wait days or even weeks to see a doctor, by which time their condition may have worsened beyond treatment. Those with chronic illnesses, such as diabetes or hypertension, rarely receive the medication they need, leading to severe complications and premature deaths. Mental health is another critical but often overlooked issue at Pollsmoor. The combination of overcrowding, violence, and long periods of isolation takes a severe toll on inmates' psychological well-being. Depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD) are common, yet there are very few mental health professionals available to provide counseling or support. Suicide attempts occur frequently, as some inmates see no escape from the brutal conditions they endure daily. Without proper mental health care, prisoners who suffer from psychological disorders often deteriorate further, making rehabilitation nearly impossible. The nutritional deficiencies at Pollsmoor also contribute to the declining health of inmates. The food provided is often of poor quality, lacking essential vitamins and minerals needed to maintain a healthy immune system. Meals typically consist of watery porridge, bread, and beans, with little to no protein or fresh vegetables. Malnutrition weakens inmates' bodies, making them more susceptible to infections and diseases. Those who fall ill recover slowly, if at all, due to the lack of proper nourishment. Despite numerous reports and legal challenges highlighting these health crises, the conditions at Pollsmoor have remained largely unchanged. Government officials and human rights organizations have called for urgent reforms, including better medical facilities, improved sanitation, and proper nutrition, yet progress has been slow. The overcrowded and underfunded prison system continues to struggle with providing even the most basic health care, leaving thousands of inmates at risk of preventable diseases and premature death. The harsh and unforgiving environment of Pollsmoor Prison takes a severe toll on the mental health of inmates, leaving many deeply scarred long after they leave its walls. The combination of overcrowding, violence, corruption, and poor living conditions creates a psychologically devastating experience for prisoners, many of whom struggle to cope with the relentless stress and trauma they face daily. For those who enter the prison system as first-time offenders, the brutal reality of Pollsmoor often transforms them into hardened individuals, stripping away any hope of rehabilitation. The long-term mental and emotional consequences of life inside Pollsmoor are far-reaching, affecting not only the prisoners themselves, but also their families and communities upon release. One of the most immediate psychological effects of incarceration at Pollsmoor is the overwhelming sense of fear and anxiety. From the moment an inmate arrives, they are thrust into an environment where violence is a constant threat. Gang activity dominates the prison, and new inmates are often targeted for extortion, assault, or forced recruitment. The fear of being attacked, whether by fellow prisoners or corrupt guards, creates a state of constant hypervigilance, where inmates must always be on guard, never knowing when danger will strike. This prolonged exposure to fear leads to chronic stress, which can have long-term effects on mental and physical health. The extreme overcrowding inside Pollsmoor worsens the psychological strain on inmates. Cells that were designed for a handful of prisoners are packed with dozens, forcing inmates to sleep shoulder to shoulder on the floor. There is little to no privacy, and personal space is almost non-existent. The noise, the stench, and the constant presence of other people create an unbearable living environment where psychological pressure builds every day. Being confined in such conditions for months or even years can lead to severe emotional distress, frustration, and eventually, a breakdown in mental stability. One of the most devastating psychological effects of Pollsmoor's conditions is depression and hopelessness. Many inmates arrive with the hope that they will eventually reintegrate into society, but as time passes, that hope fades. The brutal reality of daily life, combined with the lack of rehabilitation programs, leads many to believe that there is no future beyond prison. Suicide attempts are common, as some inmates see no escape from the suffering they endure. Without access to proper mental health care, many prisoners suffer in silence, their mental state deteriorating with each passing day. Another major issue is the trauma inflicted by violence and abuse. Many inmates experience or witness extreme brutality, whether from gang fights, beatings by guards, or sexual violence. The psychological scars left by these experiences often manifest as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, causing nightmares, flashbacks, and emotional numbness. Inmates who are repeatedly exposed to violence may become desensitized to it, adopting aggressive behaviors themselves as a survival mechanism. This not only damages their own mental well-being, but also increases the likelihood that they will engage in criminal behavior upon release. Pollsmoor's lack of mental health resources exacerbates these psychological issues. There are very few psychologists or counselors available to provide support, and mental health treatment is often not prioritized. Inmates suffering from severe psychological distress are sometimes placed in solitary confinement, which only worsens their condition. Isolation for long periods can lead to hallucinations, paranoia, and further deterioration of mental health. Instead of receiving the care they need, many inmates are left to suffer alone, trapped in a cycle of mental anguish. For young and first-time offenders, the psychological impact of Pollsmoor is particularly severe. Many of these individuals enter the prison system for minor crimes, but after enduring the horrors of Pollsmoor, they leave as hardened individuals, deeply traumatized and often more inclined toward criminal activity. The lack of rehabilitation programs means that instead of being given a chance to change, they are exposed to an environment that reinforces criminal behavior. The mental damage inflicted during their time in prison often makes it difficult for them to reintegrate into society, leading to high rates of reoffending. Even after release, the psychological effects of Pollsmoor do not simply disappear. Many former inmates struggle with severe emotional and psychological challenges long after they leave. They may experience difficulty trusting others, struggle with anger and aggression, or suffer from severe depression and anxiety. The stigma of having been in prison adds another layer of emotional distress, making it difficult to find employment, rebuild relationships, or adapt to life outside prison walls. The trauma they carry often affects their families as well, leading to strained relationships, domestic issues, and continued cycles of crime. The psychological damage caused by Pollsmoor is a reflection of the broader failures of the prison system. Instead of rehabilitating inmates and preparing them for reintegration into society, Pollsmoor's harsh conditions create long-lasting mental scars that make it nearly impossible for many to recover. Without significant reforms to improve mental health care, reduce violence, and provide proper rehabilitation programs, the prison will continue to produce individuals who are not only physically imprisoned but also mentally broken, trapped in a cycle of suffering that extends far beyond the prison gates. Pollsmoor Prison is notorious for its brutal conditions, extreme overcrowding, and gang violence. However, one of the most critical failures of the prison system is the near-complete lack of rehabilitation and reintegration programs. Prisons are meant to serve not just as places of punishment, but also as institutions where inmates can reform, learn new skills, and prepare for a future outside of crime. Unfortunately, Pollsmoor fails miserably in this regard, leaving most inmates worse off than when they entered. For many prisoners, the lack of rehabilitation begins the moment they step inside Pollsmoor. Unlike modern correctional facilities in developed countries, where structured programs help inmates develop life skills, education, and job training, Pollsmoor offers almost no opportunities for personal growth. Many inmates arrive with low levels of education, a history of poverty, and limited job skills, yet they leave with even fewer prospects than before. Instead of being guided toward a better future, they are thrown into an environment where crime and violence dominate, making it nearly impossible to escape the cycle of criminal behavior. One of the biggest gaps in Pollsmoor's rehabilitation system is the lack of educational programs. Many inmates enter prison without having completed basic schooling, yet there are very few opportunities for them to continue their education. While some prisons around the world offer high school equivalency programs, vocational training, or even university courses, Pollsmoor provides little to no access to formal education. Illiteracy and lack of knowledge make it almost impossible for inmates to find legal employment once they are released, increasing the likelihood that they will return to crime. The absence of structured learning programs means that prisoners waste years of their lives behind bars without gaining any new knowledge or skills. Similarly, there is a severe lack of vocational training programs. In many prison systems, inmates are given the chance to learn trades such as carpentry, plumbing, welding, or computer skills that can help them secure employment after release. However, at Pollsmoor, these opportunities are almost non-existent. Without practical skills, most former inmates struggle to find jobs, which pushes them back toward criminal activities. For those who were involved in gangs before their imprisonment, the lack of vocational training means they have no alternative career path upon release, making it almost certain that they will return to their old ways. One of the most damaging aspects of Pollsmoor's failure to rehabilitate inmates is its lack of psychological and behavioral reform programs. Many prisoners come from backgrounds of extreme poverty, violence, and drug addiction. Instead of receiving counseling or therapy to help them deal with their past trauma, they are thrown into a harsh and brutal environment that only reinforces negative behavior. There are no anger management programs, no addiction recovery support, and no psychological counseling available for the vast majority of inmates. Those who enter Pollsmoor with existing mental health issues often leave in an even worse state, completely unprepared to reintegrate into society. The absence of reintegration programs is one of the biggest reasons why South Africa has such high recidivism rates. In many modern prison systems, inmates close to release are gradually prepared for life outside through job placement assistance, halfway houses, and mentorship programs. However, in Pollsmoor, prisoners are simply thrown back into society with no guidance, support, or resources. Many have no home to return to, no financial stability, and no family support, making reoffending one of the only options available to them. Without assistance in finding employment, housing, or basic necessities, former inmates often go back to criminal activities as a means of survival. For young and first-time offenders, the lack of rehabilitation is particularly devastating. Many of these individuals enter Pollsmoor for minor crimes, such as theft or drug possession, but instead of being given a chance to reform, they are exposed to hardened criminals who recruit them into a lifelong cycle of crime. Without education, training, or guidance, these young inmates leave prison more dangerous and more criminally inclined than when they arrived. Instead of being corrected, they are transformed into career criminals, ensuring that they will likely return to prison in the future. Even for those inmates who genuinely want to change, the system provides no pathway for rehabilitation. There are no structured mentorship programs, no religious or moral guidance, and no incentives for good behavior that could encourage prisoners to improve themselves. The prison system in South Africa is often described as a revolving door, where prisoners serve their sentences only to return a few years later because they were never given a real chance to build a better life. This failure not only affects the prisoners themselves, but also has a devastating impact on society, as it ensures that crime remains a persistent issue, with former inmates struggling to reintegrate and often returning to a life of violence. The lack of rehabilitation at Pollsmoor is not just a failure of the prison itself, but of the entire criminal justice system. Instead of focusing on long-term solutions that reduce crime, the system relies on punishment and incarceration without addressing the root causes of criminal behavior. Until meaningful reforms are introduced, such as better education, vocational training, mental health support, and reintegration programs, Pollsmoor will continue to produce hardened criminals instead of reformed individuals. For young and first-time offenders, Pollsmoor Prison is not just a place of punishment. It is a brutal and often life-changing experience that shapes their future, usually for the worse. The prison, originally designed to house the most dangerous criminals, offers no special accommodations or protections for those who have committed lesser crimes or are new to the prison system. Instead, young and inexperienced inmates are thrown into a hostile environment where survival depends on toughness, gang affiliations, and an ability to adapt to extreme conditions. This lack of separation between hardened criminals and first-time offenders turns what could have been a chance for rehabilitation into a school for crime, ensuring that many of these individuals leave Pollsmoor more dangerous than when they entered. One of the biggest dangers young offenders face in Pollsmoor is violent gang recruitment. South African prisons are controlled by powerful gangs, and Pollsmoor is no exception. These gangs, such as the Notorious numbers gangs, 20SXS, 27s, and 28s, dominate the prison system, enforcing their own brutal code of conduct. First-time offenders, especially younger inmates, are prime targets for recruitment. Upon arrival, they're often given a choice: join a gang and receive protection, or refuse and become a victim of extortion, assault, or worse. The gangs lure young inmates with promises of security, food, and status. But once inside, leaving is nearly impossible. Those who resist recruitment are often subjected to severe beatings, forced labor, or even sexual violence, making survival without gang protection nearly impossible. For many young offenders, Pollsmoor becomes a training ground for a lifetime of crime. Instead of receiving guidance or rehabilitation, they're exposed to hardened criminals who teach them new skills in violence, robbery, and drug trafficking. The older, more experienced inmates act as mentors in crime, showing the younger ones how to survive in the criminal underworld. Those who entered Pollsmoor for minor crimes, such as petty theft or drug possession, often leave with connections to organized crime networks and a deeper understanding of illegal operations. The lack of separation between high-risk and low-risk offenders ensures that first-time inmates are quickly absorbed into the violent subculture of the prison, drastically reducing their chances of ever reforming. Another major issue young inmates face is physical and sexual abuse. With overcrowding at extreme levels, weaker and younger prisoners are often preyed upon by older, more powerful inmates. Assaults are common, and those who cannot defend themselves are frequently subjected to brutal beatings. Sexual violence is also a major problem, with many young inmates being raped by gang leaders or other dominant prisoners as a way of establishing control. This kind of abuse leaves lasting physical and psychological scars, breaking the spirits of many young offenders and making them either deeply traumatized or extremely violent in response. The mental and emotional toll of Pollsmoor on young and first-time offenders is devastating. Many of these individuals enter prison already struggling with issues such as poverty, addiction, or broken family relationships. Instead of receiving counseling or rehabilitation, they are subjected to extreme violence, humiliation, and fear. Depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, are common among young inmates, but with little to no access to mental health care, most are left to suffer in silence. Some attempt suicide, unable to cope with the horrors they face daily. Others adopt the hardened, ruthless mindset as a defense mechanism, learning to shut off emotions and embrace violence as a way to survive. Education and personal development are nearly impossible for young offenders in Pollsmoor. In a properly functioning prison system, first-time offenders would be given opportunities to complete their education, learn job skills, and prepare for reintegration into society. However, in Pollsmoor, these opportunities are virtually non-existent. There are few, if any, structured educational programs, and those that do exist are severely underfunded and inaccessible to most inmates. Without education or vocational training, young offenders leave prison with no skills, no hope, and no legal way to support themselves, making reoffending almost inevitable. The lack of rehabilitation efforts is especially tragic for those who entered prison due to circumstances beyond their control. Many young offenders in Pollsmoor come from disadvantaged backgrounds, growing up in poverty-stricken communities with little access to education, job opportunities, or positive role models. Some turn to crime out of desperation, while others are influenced by older criminals in their neighborhoods. Instead of being given a second chance, they are thrown into one of the most dangerous prisons in the world, where they are treated no differently from the most violent criminals. When young offenders are finally released from Pollsmoor, they often return to society as completely different people, not reformed, but hardened by the brutal conditions they endured. The trauma, violence, and exposure to criminal networks make it extremely difficult for them to reintegrate into normal life. Many find it impossible to get jobs, return to school, or reconnect with their families, leading them to fall back into crime as the only way to survive. Some even return to prison voluntarily, believing that life behind bars, despite its horrors, is easier than struggling to survive on the outside. The failure to protect and rehabilitate young and first-time offenders at Pollsmoor is one of the greatest tragedies of the South African prison system. Instead of serving as a place of correction, the prison turns potential reformers into career criminals, ensuring that crime rates remain high and the cycle of violence continues. Without urgent reforms, such as separating young offenders from hardened criminals, introducing proper rehabilitation programs, and providing psychological support, Pollsmoor will remain a factory that produces more criminals than it corrects. The consequences of Pollsmoor Prison extend far beyond its walls. When a person is incarcerated, the impact is not limited to them alone. Their family, friends, and entire community also suffer in ways that are often overlooked. The harsh and unforgiving environment of Pollsmoor does not just punish the inmate, it punishes their loved ones as well, creating a ripple effect that spreads through entire neighborhoods, especially in low-income and crime-ridden areas where many of the prisoners come from. One of the most immediate effects of incarceration at Pollsmoor is the emotional devastation that families experience. For parents, the knowledge that their son or daughter is locked away in one of the most dangerous prisons in the world is a source of constant anguish. Many mothers and fathers live in fear, wondering whether their child is safe, whether they are being abused, or whether they will even survive their sentence. The psychological toll of having a loved one in Pollsmoor is overwhelming, as families are left with unanswered questions and a sense of powerlessness over their loved one's fate. For children of incarcerated parents, the impact is even more profound. Many inmates at Pollsmoor are young fathers or mothers who leave behind children who now must grow up without parental guidance and support. Studies have shown that children of imprisoned parents are at a much higher risk of dropping out of school, engaging in criminal activity, and experiencing mental health struggles such as anxiety and depression. The absence of a parent can lead to emotional instability, resentment, and a lack of discipline, making it far more likely that these children will follow in their parents' footsteps and end up in prison themselves. The financial burden of incarceration is another devastating effect on families. Many inmates at Pollsmoor were the primary earners in their households before their imprisonment. When they are locked away, their families are left struggling to survive without a stable source of income. Wives, parents, or siblings are often forced to take on extra jobs or financial responsibilities just to make ends meet. In some cases, families fall into extreme poverty, unable to afford rent, food, or education for their children. This financial strain can lead to family breakdowns, with some relatives abandoning the inmate altogether, seeing them as a burden rather than a victim of the system. In addition to the financial struggles, families of Pollsmoor inmates also face the social stigma associated with having a loved one in prison. In many communities, having a family member in Pollsmoor carries a deep sense of shame, leading to judgment and discrimination. Friends, neighbors, and even extended family members may distance themselves, treating the relatives of inmates as if they, too, are criminals. This isolation can be emotionally crippling, leaving families with no support system to help them cope with their struggles. For those who try to maintain a connection with their incarcerated loved ones, visiting Pollsmoor is an ordeal in itself. The prison's visiting procedures are complicated, restrictive, and often humiliating. Families, many of whom travel long distances to see their loved ones, are subjected to long waits, invasive searches, and harsh treatment from prison staff. The emotional toll of seeing a son, father, or brother in shackles, malnourished, and broken by the prison system is almost unbearable. For many, the pain of these visits is so great that they eventually stop coming, leading to a complete disconnection between inmates and their families. When prisoners are eventually released from Pollsmoor, the challenges of reintegration further strain family relationships. Many former inmates return home as completely different people, hardened by years of violence, psychological trauma, and survival in the brutal world of Pollsmoor. Some struggle with extreme anger, paranoia, or depression, making it difficult to reconnect with loved ones. Others bring the criminal lifestyle they learned in prison back into their communities, involving family members in illegal activities or influencing younger siblings and friends to follow their path. Communities with high incarceration rates, particularly in impoverished townships around Cape Town, bear the brunt of Pollsmoor's failures. When inmates return home without rehabilitation, they often fall back into crime, leading to higher rates of gang violence, drug trafficking, and repeat offenses. These areas become trapped in a vicious cycle. Young men are arrested, sent to Pollsmoor, released without any support, and then quickly reoffend, leading to more crime, more police presence, and more broken families. Instead of reducing crime, Pollsmoor contributes to a system that ensures it continues, generation after generation. For the families who try to support their loved ones post-incarceration, the lack of government support makes reintegration nearly impossible. Former inmates struggle to find jobs due to their criminal records, and many employers refuse to hire someone who has spent time in Pollsmoor. Without stable employment, many ex-prisoners become financially dependent on their families, increasing the stress and hardship on already struggling households. In some cases, families are forced to make impossible choices, either turn their backs on their loved ones or risk being dragged into their criminal activities as they try to survive. Even when former inmates genuinely want to reform and rebuild their lives, the stigma of having been in Pollsmoor follows them everywhere. Society often refuses to accept them back, and without opportunities for education, employment, or psychological support, they find themselves trapped in an endless cycle of poverty and crime. The long-term impact of Pollsmoor on families and communities is clear. It does not just punish criminals. It destroys families, tears apart relationships, and fuels the very problems it is supposed to solve. Without major reforms that focus on rehabilitation, reintegration, and community support, the suffering caused by Pollsmoor will continue to ripple outward, affecting generations to come. Pollsmoor Prison stands as a harsh symbol of the failures of the criminal justice system, not just in South Africa, but globally. Overcrowded, violent, and devoid of meaningful rehabilitation programs, it has become a breeding ground for crime rather than a place of correction. The dire conditions within its walls, where disease, gang violence, and abuse are rampant, highlight the urgent need for reform. Without significant changes, Pollsmoor will continue to produce hardened criminals instead of reformed individuals, fueling a cycle of crime that extends beyond the prison gates and into communities already struggling with poverty, violence, and instability. One of the most critical areas that require reform is overcrowding. Originally designed to house far fewer inmates, Pollsmoor now operates at well over its intended capacity, forcing prisoners to live in inhumane and degrading conditions. Cells meant for a handful of inmates hold dozens, sometimes even over 100, leaving them with no space to sleep, move, or even breathe properly. The lack of proper bedding, ventilation, and sanitation has turned Pollsmoor into a breeding ground for disease, with tuberculosis and other infections spreading rapidly among inmates. Addressing overcrowding requires more than just building new prisons. It calls for changes in sentencing laws, alternative punishment for non-violent offenders, and a focus on rehabilitation over mass incarceration. Another urgent issue is the violence that dominates life at Pollsmoor. The prison is controlled by notorious gangs, such as the numbers gangs, 20 SIXS, 27s, and 28s, which dictate the rules of survival within its walls. New inmates, especially young and first-time offenders, are thrown into an environment where they must either join a gang for protection or become victims of brutal beatings, sexual abuse, and extortion. The correctional system's failure to control gang activity means that instead of being reformed, inmates become more deeply entrenched in criminal networks. To combat this, stronger security measures, intelligence-led policing within prisons, and efforts to dismantle gang influence are necessary. Prison officials must be held accountable for corruption and negligence, as many of them turn a blind eye or even actively participate in the violent power structures that control the prison. A major flaw in Pollsmoor's system is the complete lack of rehabilitation and reintegration programs. Prisons should not only punish but also prepare inmates for a future outside of crime. However, Pollsmoor offers little to no educational or vocational training opportunities, leaving inmates with no skills to build a better life once they are released. Without job training, literacy programs, or psychological support, prisoners return to society without the tools needed to survive legally, making reoffending almost inevitable. Countries with successful prison reform models focus on rehabilitation through education, skill building, and mental health care, and South Africa must follow suit. Expanding educational programs, creating vocational training opportunities, and providing structured pathways for reintegration would not only reduce recidivism, but also improve public safety by ensuring former inmates have a chance to contribute positively to society. The poor treatment of inmates is another major area in need of reform. Pollsmoor's prisoners are often treated as less than human, enduring extreme physical and psychological abuse from both guards and fellow inmates. Reports of torture, beatings, and sexual violence are widespread, yet accountability is almost non-existent. Prison officials must be trained in human rights-based correctional approaches, ensuring that inmates are treated with basic dignity. Independent monitoring bodies should be given unrestricted access to inspect prisons, investigate complaints, and hold abusive guards accountable. The culture of violence and dehumanization within Pollsmoor must be dismantled for any meaningful change to take place. One of the biggest oversights in the South African prison system is the failure to address mental health issues among inmates. Many prisoners enter Pollsmoor with existing mental health conditions, including depression, PTSD, and substance abuse disorders. Instead of receiving treatment, they are thrown into a brutal environment that worsens their condition. Suicide rates among inmates remain high, and many engage in self-harm as a desperate response to their suffering. Implementing mental health screening, counseling services, and addiction recovery programs would not only improve the well-being of inmates, but also reduce violent outbursts, self-harm, and long-term psychological damage. A prison system that ignores mental health issues only deepens the cycle of crime, as untreated trauma leads many former inmates to commit offenses again after release. The impact of Pollsmoor's failures extends beyond the prison walls, affecting families and communities. Many of the inmates come from already marginalized and impoverished backgrounds, and their imprisonment often plunges their families deeper into financial and emotional crisis. Children of incarcerated individuals are more likely to drop out of school, experience poverty, and turn to crime themselves, perpetuating an intergenerational cycle of criminality. To break this pattern, reform should focus on family support programs, education initiatives for children of prisoners, and community-based reintegration efforts that provide former inmates with housing,